This one is for me. Well, it was supposed to be for someone else, but they were a no-show. A while back, a person contacted me asking if I could convert a guitar to fretless for them, accompanied by a link to a video of a Turkish musician named Hasan Sihat Ortur. I hope I'm pronouncing that somewhat correct. I'll put a link in the description to the video. Anyway, I'd actually been thinking about doing a fretless electric conversion for a while now, for a number of reasons. When I was at the Fretboard Summit this summer, I looked at and briefly got to play one of the conversions made by Duncan Price, otherwise known as Disco Baby, on Instagram, who does these wild, sympathetic feedback and sustain mods with like onboard reverb tanks and a bunch of other stuff, and they're really hard to describe, but they're genuinely captivating, both to look at and to play. So I watched the video of Hasan, and he's playing a fretless guitar with an ebow, which, to quickly explain to those who aren't electric guitar nerds, is a small handheld device that magnetically excites the string in a continuous feedback loop in conjunction with the pickup on the guitar. It's sort of a push-pull kind of deal to keep the string moving. And you get something like the bowing effect you have with a violin or a cello. The Edge from U2 got a lot of mileage out of an ebow back in the 80s. Think With or Without You, for instance, those long, sustained, chimey sounds. So I'm like, yay! This is rather exciting. And I tell the customer I can do it during a particular week. He agrees, it draws near, I email him, no answer. I wait several days, email again, saying, hey, if you want to do it, better get back to me soon or I'm going to have to move on, because I'm booked solid. He said, okay, how about this date and time? I said, sure. The date and time arrives, no customer, no explanation, which, you know, is kind of part of the business. We're dealing with musicians, after all. And I try not to take it personally when it happens. It doesn't happen very often. But, you know, I'm also not going to go out of my way to do work for people who behave this way towards me. However, rather than actually take a day off, which we know is functionally impossible for me, I'm going to do this thing anyway, because I want to do it. I went to the local marketplace site. Here it's Kijiji, sort of like Craigslist. I found an inexpensive Yamaha. I've also got a less expensive knockoff ebow. I'm going to go for it. This is a Yamaha Pacifica. I've worked on a number of these over the years. I think one may have even made it into a video. And I've always been impressed by the sort of bang for the buck factor. I believe this is Korean made. They started producing them in the 90s. There are a bunch of different models. This particular one, very Strat inspired. Master volume, master tone, the familiar shape. It's kind of like a cross between a Strat and an Ibanez. Pretty good build quality. I believe the body seems to be ash. It might be some kind of elm, maybe an Asian elm, but it looks like ash to me and feels like ash. And, you know, what I liked about it versus some of the other inexpensive deals I saw on the interwebs there was this has got the rosewood fingerboard. Because if you're going to do a fretless conversion, it's much easier to conceal the damage from removing the frets in rosewood versus, say, a lacquered maple neck, for instance, which, you know, it chips and shows off all the imperfections, and it's just a big hassle. So, yeah, I'm kind of excited. So I did what some of you guys seem to do and bought it without even plugging it in. No idea how it sounds. The gentleman said it worked. So let's see. A little dusty, eh? Yeah, it'll be fine. Anyway, I got it for an exceptionally reasonable price. And I was looking at it standing on this guy's front step and said, well, don't know about the truss rod. And he says, well, no, it has a truss rod. We'll see. I suspect this has probably never been adjusted in its life. Probably takes a 4 or maybe a 5 millimeter. That's a pretty chunky looking thing there. Yeah, 5.5 millimeters is too big. So I guess we're going to call that a 5 millimeter. And that functions. The neck is actually extremely straight, to the point where there's probably too little relief, if anything. But I'm going to put some heavier strings on it. Okay, got it tuned up. The action is way high. It's 8/64ths, both bass and treble. And, well, it's going to be even taller than that with the frets removed. So this thing is probably going to need a shim. Also, the tremolo springs have been set, so there's quite a bit of float. I'm probably going to tighten those down so this thing ends up hard against the body. The trem cover here has had a little repair with some rather yellowed epoxy. Looks like a booger. Yeah, this is definitely ash. I've worked with enough ash to know. It's probably North American ash too. This is from that weird point in the 90s when Asian imports were doing most of their savings in terms of labor rather than materials. So you get some pretty nice wood in some of these things. Okay, well, let's tighten those screws. This is the claw. These springs regulate the amount of tension on the inertia block, the bridge, and can regulate how much it floats above the body, or if you want it to come back to a hard return. You just tighten these up and it'll level out. Need a little bit more. It might almost be better if there was an extra spring in there, but that's okay. I must confess, I actually like a really tough tremolo bar. If I'm going to use one, I want to fight it. I don't want it to be too quivery. Yeah, we'll call that good. Relief in the neck here with the capo on the first fret, holding down the string at the body, measuring at the 6th and 7th frets. This is just for giggles, really, because the frets are coming out, but we got about 3/1000ths, which is a little on the tight side to my mind, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to plane the board into whatever shape I want it to be. Okay, let's contemplate this magnificent structure under the nut. Realistically, this is impossible to play. Like, I'll check it by pressing down between the 2nd and 3rd frets and observing the clearance over top of the 1st fret. There should be just a tiny little hair there, so much that you have to kind of get up and sight against a light to see it. I mean, in actual terms, without pressing down the strings, there should be about 21/1000ths of an inch, which is about 1/2 millimeter. And I should probably measure this just to see. This is almost 2 millimeters, so it's literally 4 times the height it should be. If you give this to a kid for Christmas, expecting him to learn how to play, no. This would be murder. But again, this is the state of things if you buy stuff online. A parent who doesn't know about guitars buys this and gives it to their kids, so it's probably a good thing that I was the one who came along and took it off the market. Probably can't even blame the seller. He probably doesn't know. If one goes years without changing strings and they just sort of sit there in the block forever, sometimes the ball ends will get, well, I'm not sure if we'll call it corroded, but it tends to bond with the metal around it. So get yourself a really skinny little Allen key and push down on them from above, alleviating that problem. Gotta say, the aesthetics of unstained, slightly suntanned ash really gives off that sort of mid-90s coffee table vibe. Have a look here. Ooh, that's a beefy little electronics package. Wow, it's heavier than you expect. Big brass plate under the humbucker. And on the back side of the middle pickup it says Gifman. Or is that Gifman? G-I-F. Gif? GIF? Who knows? Mini pots, Alpha, 500K. Simple. Direct. No problem with that. But again, there is some mass in this humbucker. Like, this is not your bargain basement guitar. Spray some electronics cleaner in the pots. those all cleaned out. This thing has a generous swimming pool style of route for the pickups, and they've included wells for the screws for a neck humbucker if you wanted to go that way. So if you're into modding something, you want to try stuff out, this is perfect. Don't have to worry about routing out any material. Okay, while my soldering iron is heating up, I'm just going to go ahead and make a little score line on either side of the frets. As I've mentioned in the past, this acts like a stop cut, so that when I pull the frets out, the tangs, which are currently under the surface, and usually they're pushed a little to the side due to the curved nature of the fret when it's installed, they tend to tear wood out when you pull them up. So what this does is it tends to stop those little splits from moving out into the board too far. This doesn't have to be very deep, it's just almost like the depth of a pencil line if you're using a hard lead. I'm going to be able to sand most of that line away when it comes time to dress the board. I'm just going to heat up the fret with my old 25-watt soldering iron here. I've modified the tip so that it's slightly concave. It's less likely to jump off the fret. And I'll heat the entire surface going back and forth. This takes about 30 seconds or so. There are faster ways to do it. You can use a much hotter iron. I've seen a nifty device that was made out of one of those soldering guns that have tips that have two wires. It's usually a loop. People will cut the loop in half and touch both sides of the remaining wires to the fret, and that completes the circuit, so the electricity runs right through it. I don't usually find that necessary. So heating it up just sort of gently warms up whatever's in there. Sometimes there can be glue, other times it's just schmutz. Congealed oil from fretboard oiling, finger grease. Sometimes it's a green mossy material we don't want to know the origin of. And just go back and forth using my fret lifting pliers. And that comes out very satisfyingly clean. I like the looks of that. I'll get started on the fretboard by knocking off some of the accumulated grime and truing it up a little bit with a radius sanding block with some 120 grit paper. I'll clean out the fret slots using a fret saw with a depth guide on it. This will give me a consistent trench there for my veneer inlay, which I'm making out of a piece of holly wood. Hooray. And I'm just going to cut off little 1/8" strips here. This stuff is fairly thick veneer. It is actually a little bit too thick for the slots. So I'm going to have to resize that using my veneer sizer, made out of an old plane blade held at an angle to a block. Got to knock off about 2/1000 off each piece. This is what the neck pocket looks like. A lot of positioning holes for various jigs, and there's some signatures, QC stamps. The veneer fits into the slot nicely. It's not too tight, not too loose, just about right. So I'll go ahead and glue these in using some thin super glue, a little bit on either side. This will be a multi-stage process, as there's still some chips and divots alongside each slot from the fret barbs, which will need to be filled. Here I'm paring away a little bit of excess height from the inlays using a curved bottom plane. The rounded blade profile means I can work on the veneer without worrying about the corners digging into the fingerboard. I'll make some rosewood dust, which always appears more purple until you put glue into it. It's just an offcut of an old side. I'll dab little spoonfuls along the borders of each fret. This doesn't have to be too neat, as it's all going to get sanded down to one plane, and this will again take more than one application to get things filled up. So we'll saturate the mess using more super glue. And I'll start the leveling process with some 220 grit on the bottom of this old level. It's my leveling beam level. I need to make a new bone nut, so I'll use the half pencil to trace the curve on the front surface. And then I'll make another mark about 30 thousandths above that, and I'll cut to that line. That will minimize the amount of material that I need to file through when establishing the string slots. So I use my regular nut files to do. I sanded the surface of the fingerboard up to 6,000 grit with micromesh pads. Even using flat wound strings, it's not likely to stay this shiny for very long, but it's nice to start off that way. Putting on a coat of Danish oil. Here we can see what the finished inlays look like. To correct the neck angle, I need to make a tapered shim for the neck pocket. I decided to go a little wild and pinstripe this thing. Got some sign painter's enamel. This stuff sticks to almost anything and it's packed full of pigment. I have this special brush. It's not technically a classic pinstripe brush. It's almost like a long quill with a short handle. Striping and sign painting is its own little world. It's something I'd love to get into if I had more time to practice. This is the act of paleting, as it's called, which brings the paint to the proper consistency and it trains the bristles. I decided to use the Mohawk College flyer because they canceled their music program last week, betraying their sentiment as they make people stop learning music. Knaves. Anyway, this is me pretending. The craft of pinstriping, of course, goes back to the coach and carriage maker's trade. It blossomed again in the custom car culture of California in the 1950s and 60s, and it's still very much alive today in lowrider circles. The long bristles of the brush hold a lot of paint, and someone who's good at this can perform extraordinary feats, The test is to do straight lines, and of course I didn't do any straight lines because I knew I would fail that test. I just wanted to have fun and sort of slip off into my own Bob Ross world. We'll make some happy little shapes. I'm doing this on an unfilled, deeply poured surface, which in retrospect is not the easiest thing to paint on because it provides a whole bunch of little potholes you've got to run over with your brush. So I got some skips and some stuff that I had to go back and correct, but again, I'm not too worried about this guitar. Every once in a while I have to go back and re-palette to load up the bristles again, make sure they're straight. Well, they're not really like bristles, they're more like hair. I think this one is synthetic, but I think previously they were made out of squirrel hair, sable, something. It's an interesting thing. For a person who's used to more traditional artist's brushes, it takes a while to get the hang of. I'm concentrating probably entirely too much. I probably should have just whipped this off. There are people these days who do a contemporary take on this using paint markers, basically like a juicy Sharpie. Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top occasionally stripes guitars that way. This is a different thing. I can tell that if I practiced every day for a year or so, I might be able to get good at it, but sometimes we do things just for the experience, I'll add an ivory color, which sort of matches the pick guard. A little bit of contrast. I don't know where the designs are coming from. I didn't sketch anything out. I'm just sort of going with the flow, as it were. The paint has a very distinctive feel on the surface. It's a kind of draggy feeling, not unlike French polishing. And steering the brush is sort of like manipulating the tiller on a boat. Analyzing the designs in retrospect, I think I was going for something of a 1950s tiki bar ambiance. The main thing is to know when to stop, of course. I may have taken it too far. We'll install the neck shim. Put the neck back on. Playing fretless, it makes sense to use a flat wound string, so I got some of these Roto Sound top tapes, 12 to 52s. A little bit of work to dial in the nut height. Alright, I set it up with an action that felt reasonable, which is about 4/64 on the bass side, slightly lower on the treble. Some observations. Having actual fret marker positions on the lines of the frets is very helpful. I've played fretless instruments without any markers of any kind, found that kind of frustrating. The thing is, of course, you got to get your finger right on that line, or maybe a hair behind it. It helps to play around with a tuner for a while to sort of figure out where it's got to be. Playing complex chords is probably not going to happen, because you physically can't get every finger in just the right spot quick enough. Maybe after several years you could develop that skill. This is my sustainer device. This is a Joyo JGE01, not a sponsor. It has a little track on the bottom, and you align the string in there, and there's sort of a sweet spot. It's not too difficult to find. Really quite fun, and in conjunction with other effects, you get all kinds of atmospheric tones. It's also got a two-way switch that puts an octave harmonic into the sound, which is useful.